Good news. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 is the best the MCU has offered us in over a year and a half, but it's a seriously mixed bag that's overall quality hinges on what happens in 5 or 6 minutes out of a 2.5-hour film. Although that speaks to how great those 5 or 6 minutes are, it doesn't bode well for the rest of the movie. Chris Pratt returns as Star-Lord, and while he was trying to figure out his voice for the Mario movie last year...
Hey, where's the freaking gabagoo? You motherfucker.
He managed to squeeze in filming his third outing as Peter Quill along with the rest of the gang almost 6 years after the release of Volume 2. Guardians 3 is tough to review, and I spent about 10 hours of my weekend discussing it on various YouTube channels. It's definitely not a bad movie, definitely not an amazing movie, but resting right on the definitely okay button. But damn, is it nice to have a proper movie to discuss like it used to be pre-Phase 4. There are extreme highs that offset some questionable choices, and a plot that's almost exclusively by the numbers. But James Gunn clearly loves these characters, and it was made by people who really give a shit, and that means something. It means they respect the audience, our investment, and Gunn did a good enough job giving these heroes a proper send-off, although the ending itself feels like an obligatory separation rather than anything making sense. With all that said, it's no Marvel Savior. This film is so isolated from the rest of the MCU that its quality won't reflect on the greater Marvel IP. I don't think this will be tricking people into thinking the MCU has been restored after Phase 4 and Ant-Man 3 were complete disasters. The Guardians at this point feel disconnected, and I think people attending want to see what happens with their beloved heroes, and aren't worried about what interconnecting elements the film has with the greater MCU story, of which it has practically none anyway. I'm happy to say that unlike a lot of my MCU reviews over the last year, I'm not really going to shit on this movie. It simply doesn't deserve it because it's not shit. The mere fact I can spend my weekend on various podcasts discussing this without it becoming a slamfest is refreshing. The MCU isn't back, but at least there's a proper movie to break down. So thank you for that, Mr. Gunn. Let's start with the plot setup and understand where we are before we get to the criticisms and praise. We find the Guardians on Nowhere, which they had purchased from the collector during the Guardians of the Galaxy holiday special on Disney+. They're trying to guard the galaxy from here, but their leader Star-Lord is still a mess after the loss and subsequent return of Gamora from another timeline. Adam Warlock, who we last saw at the end of Volume 2 some 6 years ago, comes careening out of nowhere to attack them, mortally wounding Rocket before being incapacitated by Nebula. The Guardians fix their wounds thanks to the introduction of some crazy medpack thing that instantly heals or repairs fucking anything, which sure would have been nice if they had those for Tony Stark at the end of Endgame, but they can't heal Rocket because he has a kill switch on his heart, which apparently prevents anyone from helping him if he's wounded. The kill switch was put there by his creator, which means instead of having an automatic kill switch to just kill him if he ever escaped, it's more of a troll. But this is the inciting incident to set up the story of the whole movie. The Guardians are on a mission to save Peter's best friend, Rocket Raccoon, with Nebula enlisting her sister Gamora to feed her into the gears of the story too. Let's start with the positives, which already tells you it's a cut above recent MCU movies that had almost no redeeming qualities. This film actually has some good stuff amongst its cinematic brethren, like it's at a party it wasn't invited to.
Sherman! Hey! What the fuck are you doing here?
The biggest thing working in this film's favor is the flashback scenes fleshing out Rocket's origin, which becomes the emotional crux of the entire film. These scenes are heartbreaking and have the most satisfying payoff I've felt in some time. I'm sure I'm not alone in saying a lot of these scenes were extremely impactful and can damn near bring a man to tears. The voice acting in these scenes by Bradley Cooper is off the charts, and it's undoubtedly his best outing as Rocket Raccoon. He brings a vulnerable element to Rocket we've never heard before, and there's a moment in particular that is absolutely gut-wrenching thanks in no small part to Cooper's contribution. The flashbacks make the movie, which is also a criticism, but I'll save that for the moment. For Chris Pratt, playing the role of Star-Lord helped shoot him into the stratosphere, and he caps off his trilogy in rousing fashion. I'll admit, there are times when I thought he was phoning it in, but I watched the movie twice, and after my second viewing, I feel it suited the character and where we find him at the beginning of the movie. There's a scene in the trailer where you see him screaming in emotional agony, and not to give away what it is, but his performance in that moment matches Bradley Cooper's in being simply excellent. He said he'd welcome coming back as Star-Lord, and I'd be more than happy if he did. Chikwadi Iwuji, who plays the High Evolutionary, is also a great actor playing a good villain. I still like Baron Zemo as my favorite MCU villain, but the High Evolutionary ranks pretty high on the list. He chews up the scenery a little too much sometimes, but the character itself is a pretty cool concept, with an actual explanation for his powers, instead of magic bullshit powers that have no defined limit or rules. I can already see Marvel trying to figure out how he's a Kang variant so they can replace Jonathan Majors. The B plot of the film is dealing with Peter and Gamora, and it's another thing I have to praise. Remember how the Loki show had a scene where it brought the 2012 Loki up to speed so that we as the audience were basically made to accept him as the same old Loki we'd always known, even though he's not, since the real one died at the beginning of Infinity War? James Gunn doesn't play that stupid game here. The film deals with the fact this isn't the same Gamora, and we see Quill having to deal with it and accept that fact. I was really scared after seeing Loki that Guardians 3 was just going to be about Quill getting Gamora back, or we just see her insta-accept who she's meant to be in some contrived bullshit way like the Loki show did, but thankfully that's not the case here. I want to compliment the CGI too, which is finally on point. VFX have been criticized out the asshole when it comes to the MCU since Phase 4 began, and rightfully so. It's been absolutely atrocious. And that is not the case here at all. It's like Marvel understood Guardians as one of their top tier properties, so best not fuck this up, and poured plenty of resources into it to make this film look absolutely beautiful. I don't blame the VFX departments of other MCU films. It's a known fact that they are overworked with the absolute deluge of garbage Marvel has made them pump out. But it seems like the teams working on this one were allowed plenty of money and resources to produce an absolutely stunning product. Everything from the sets, background CGI, and wild-looking creatures are stunning and believable. James Gunn was also allowed to get away with some serious body horror in this movie. He directed the films Slither and Super before moving to major blockbusters with the original Guardians film, and those movies had some gory elements, and it seems like Marvel really let him get away with some extra horrific stuff here. For some folks, it might be a little too much, especially if you're bringing kids to see this, but a huge kudos to Marvel for letting Gunn do his thing. The mood of the movie is pretty damn somber despite its comedic beats that have become a hallmark of the Guardians franchise. With that said, I'm pleased with the mood of the finale, and it really suits our heroes, and the tone matches that of the other films in the trilogy. It's hard to say I'm satisfied with the send-off, but I suppose that's another thing that comes with a caveat that I'll get to. No matter what, James Gunn loves these characters, and it's apparent to anyone watching. There's no cynicism or malice or disdain here that you feel some of the other MCU films have. Like Taika Waititi treating Thor like a complete idiot, or the bastardization of Doctor Strange in his own film, sidelining him for some newbie character. Criticisms are up next, but on a positive note, this film was made by people who care, and it's apparent. The message of the film is compassion and friendship, and Gunn does his best to showcase those things and succeeds most of the time. I'm done with the praise, so let's get into the criticisms, which there are many, and let's get right to the point. The best part of the movie is the flashback scenes, and it also feels completely separate from the rest of the film. They are dropped in almost randomly, or when Gunn feels like there's a decent enough break from the main story. And while they exist to help bolster the theme of friendship, particularly how important friendship is to Rocket, it unintentionally serves to undermine what should have been the main focus, his and Quill's friendship. Despite the tacit connection to the main story, it feels so disconnected that I almost wish it was its own separate thing because it absolutely has merit. I mean, shit, it's the best thing in the movie. Maybe it would have worked better if it was its own Disney Plus special, perhaps. Because outside of these flashback scenes that have no real impact on the main story, the movie feels like an absolute by-the-numbers chore. A main character is injured, so we have to have a MacGuffin chase to save them that brings us to point A, to point B, to point C. And those points are uninspired and pretty bland. The OrgaCorp scene that makes up the bulk of the second act is just a side quest, followed up by another side quest to Counter-Earth that practically serves the exact same purpose. Remove the flashback scenes, and this movie almost feels entirely like an extended cut of that shitty space casino scene in The Last Jedi. Just a giant-ass side mission. The final act feels like a Guardians movie, and there's emotional weight there that's actually between our main characters. Although this movie is absolutely riddled with fake-out death after fake-out death that left me feeling numb inside. There are constantly moments where a character actually feels like they're about to eat shit, and it's just boy who cried wolf after a certain point, yet James Gunn plays it up each time. I swear, there's a fake-out death for every single lead character in this, and it became obnoxious after this epic tragic scene that takes place, and then the very next moment the character's fucking fine. If you remove the entire OrgaCorp scene, this film would play out exactly the same, yet it takes up a massive chunk of the film. The flashbacks set up the climax with the High Evolutionary, and they are the best parts of the movie. So if we kept those and removed the OrgaCorp section, it would free up the movie to do what it's trying to tell us, showing Rocket and Peter being best friends. The film tells you they're best friends, but how often have you seen them interact? And I mean really. In Guardians 2, Rocket is away from the group half the movie. In Infinity War, he goes with Thor and Groot. In Endgame, Quill isn't back until the final scene. Where have we seen these two characters be best friends? We just rely on the screenplay telling us they are. It would have been nice to remove almost half the movie, keep the flashbacks, and spend the extra time that frees up actually showing us the characters interacting that we want to see together. Because what we get is Rocket spending almost the entire movie incapacitated. And spoilers, so skip if you haven't seen it, Rocket's love, Lila, tells him when he's about to enter the afterlife that he has to go back. We've firmly established how much Rocket loves his lost animal friends at this point in the movie, and instead of, say, Rocket hearing Quill's voice and deciding to go back, he's told to by someone else, completely undermining Star-Lord and Rocket's friendship. This leads to my complaint about the ending, where each character kind of goes their separate ways out of what feels like obligation because this is the final movie, so they can't stay together because why wouldn't we keep seeing the Guardian stories if they did? After all this talking about how Rocket's his best friend, it didn't sit well with me that Peter decides to go back to Earth to see his uncle, someone he's never mentioned or given a shit about before until midway through this movie to set up some contrived reason to leave. Maybe it's just me, but if my friend was hurt and I went across the galaxy killing hundreds of creatures and stopping yet another world-ending villain to save their life, I'd never want to leave their side. Speaking of which, there have been some talks about how this film thankfully doesn't deal with massive high-stakes threats, and it's a more intimate story. Sorry, no, that's not the case. In fact, the High Evolutionary destroys an entire planet, killing millions if not billions of people. Not what I'd call low stakes. And I also found it hilarious the Guardians didn't even give two shits about it or even have a passing line about how awful that might have been. Fuck it, why not?
I will say this,
why not? Yeah.
I will say this, that one of the main complaints a lot of people have had about Phase 4 and now Phase 5 is the multiversal stuff, the fact that nothing's seen. What does it matter? For
Agreed.
this one did dial it back in pretty successfully to us caring about something that wasn't a multiversal threat.
Yeah.
So I will at least give it that it was able to make you care about a much smaller scale story.
A planet was destroyed with millions of people on it. The Guardians didn't give a flying fuck either. I was just like, oh shit, good thing we weren't on that.
That may be the greatest comeback ever.
Adam Warlock is also completely fucking wasted in this movie, and interviews with James Gunn kind of allude to the fact he didn't want to include him and was kind of forced to.
Because I know fans have been asking you for years, even before Guardians 2, when you get the tease, like, what's going on with Adam Warlock? Did you feel pressure to put him in? And, like, how close to what the final product is what you had in your head?
I did feel pressure to put him in. I wrote a lot of the stuff was written for Volume 2. Originally, Adam Warlock was in Volume 2.
Mm-hmm.
You can see what Marvel actually thinks of characters by the way they adapt them. Adam Warlock is an ultra-powerful and kick-ass character in the comics, and he led the battle against Thanos in the Infinity Gauntlet storyline. Essentially, the role Captain Marvel ended up taking over for the Infinity War Endgame saga for obvious reasons. So what do we get? A character that wouldn't change the story at all if he were removed or replaced by someone else. And they've turned him into a complete dumbass to boot. Yes, there's a story reason for why he's so stupid, but that doesn't make him not stupid. He's stupid and shouldn't be. There's also an overindulgence in the licensed music department with this movie. There are 17 fucking songs in this film. I counted 4 licensed tracks played in the first 18 minutes of the movie. It's like Gunn thought because this is his last Guardians flick, he needed to shove everything he could in here, appropriate or not. Despite the kick-ass music selection, it just becomes noise at some point. Literally too much of a good thing becoming obnoxious and less special with every song played. With each positive end of the movie having an unfortunate negative, it's weird to think about what would happen if you took out certain things. The first act is Adam Warlock completely wasted with a contrived reason to keep Rocket out of the movie. The second act is a treasure hunt, paint by numbers and boring, and the best part of the movie is the flashbacks. So does that make it a good movie? All in all, I will say though, I did have positives of the movie. It is funny that it's actually, like, the biggest positives were the things that I didn't even want in the movie, which was the emotional crutch created with the flashbacks. I was like, that would have been better if it was a separate thing.
So the question to ask you then is, so those flashback sequences, they amount to a grand total of, I think, 10 or 11 minutes.
Yeah, of a 2.5 hour movie.
So imagine if those 10 or 11 minutes were removed from the movie. What would be your assessment of the film then?
Did not like this movie probably in the end. Yeah.
That's not fair.
So the whole thing rests essentially on 10 minutes of screen time, and that's a pretty weak crutch to like support an entire film. I totally get your opinion of this one. I totally understand because I felt that same emotional reaction to it as well. And it's like, generally speaking, anytime a movie can almost move me to tears, it's doing something really good. It's doing something really, really effective there. But if it's all tied into this very small segment and the rest of it is just pretty bland, mediocre, and very flawed, I have to think, well, on balance, is this a good film?
And again, those flashbacks undercut the actual relationship I would have liked to have seen more of between Rocket and Peter. I discussed this movie to death over opening weekend on separate podcasts, including talking this part over with the guys on EFAP.
The highs that come from all the stuff with Rocket's origin are like they make the whole film worth it for me, even though the plot is and it's gonna get worse. But like this is the stuff that is totally makes the movie for me. It's incredible.
Oh, I mean, if this wasn't in the movie, like if this,
God, if it wasn't in the movie, holy shit.
Yeah.
I have to completely disagree.
Do it.
Okay. I really do enjoy the scenes, and I think they're really good. Like, this is fantastic stuff. But I also hate the fact that this has to happen now in the third movie, the sixth appearance. I feel like if it was going to happen, it should have happened at some other moment in the chronology. I understand what they're doing with it. It's setting up, how important friends are to Rocket. That's the crux of the story: compassion and friendship. James Gunn even said that himself. But all the same, like, you have so many brilliant characters that have to have their finale now, and I wanted to see more about their relationship with each other. I just didn't feel like I got that with this movie. Like, I wanted to see more about Quill and Rocket together, like they're best friends, and you don't really get that. And I just feel like it feels so separated all the same. Like, even though it helps out the primary story.
I'm actually
still bothered me that it was even here.
There's an irony here of, like, I think there's bloat to this film, but I wouldn't even cut a second of the animal stuff. I would have cut out the entirety of the Orgo scope thing.
Yep, that should go.
I think my big disagreement, my big disagreement with you here is that I think the fact that the whole thrust of the narrative is Peter trying to save Rocket is like a nice way of developing their friendship and stuff like that. I mean, it's very straightforward, but it's incredibly powerful stuff.
Something I would say to actually bolster, well, to some extent, the point that you brought up with the absence of interaction between Rocket and the team, at least so far in the film. Something that's interesting to note is that I'm actually forgetting if I've said this like today or on the other like when I was on Open Bar.
It's been 4 hours, so maybe.
But it is actually kind of surprising. Guardians 1, Rocket is interacting with the team a bunch. Guardians 2, he's separated from the team from a good portion of the movie. Infinity War, he's separated from the team for a good portion of the movie, hanging out with Thor. And Endgame is with the Avengers. It's actually been a while since you've had Rocket like with the full team, like interacting. It's actually been kind of a while.
Yeah, though I think that's a bigger complaint I have about 2 than 3. Because the way they get separated in 2 is kind of stupid. And this one is much more meaningful.
I like him and Yondu, though.
I like him and Yondu a bunch.
I think all that this does, honestly, is just speak to how good Rocket is, that you could throw him with a whole bunch of different characters, and he's great with everybody. He's great with Yondu, he's great with Thor.
He's great really with all of them, but I think if
now,
go ahead.
Like where we're at in the MCU, Rocket's like top tier.
With some highs that are accompanied by some serious lows, Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 is an A-OK conclusion to the story of our galactic heroes. Unfortunately, the film barely opened higher than Ant-Man 3 to just $114 million. A good figure, but far below the second Guardians film's $146 million 6 years ago. Audiences don't seem to be as critical of this one as I am, so the lack of enthusiasm by general audiences as far as attendance goes really does suggest some superhero fatigue setting in. It also tells me people aren't seeing the MCU as separate franchises. They're seeing it as one giant franchise, and the poor quality of an Ant-Man movie can impact how people feel about seeing a Guardians movie. One bad MCU movie does in fact reflect poorly on the next, regardless of what hero or heroes are in it. Because Volume 3 is so separated from the rest of the MCU, I don't think it's some sort of franchise savior that some people are expecting or hoping it is. All things considered though, I still recommend seeing it if you're on the fence, because it's the best you'll get out of a bad bunch of MCU projects over the last couple of years, and at the very least, it was made by people who care. GG's.